Welcome back. We are on week 4 of the course. This is on philosophy of science. You may notice I'm recording in a car. It's a long story. I'm waiting for a repairman. They give you like a 3-hour window, and so I thought I'd make good use of the time and record some lectures. So we're talking about philosophy of science. There's many sort of topics we could have covered in philosophy of science, like the nature of causation, the problem of induction, and the whether scientific realism, right? Whether we should take scientific theories literally or not. Um, lots of, anyways, the nature of scientific progress, right? Um, Lots of fun topics, right? It's an area that I'm particularly interested in. I thought I'd focus in on laws of nature. What are laws of nature? Even if you're not, studying one of the sciences, you've probably heard of laws of nature, right? Force equals mass times acceleration, and right? That's one of Newton's laws. Um, There's laws in psychology, which is the area I work in primarily. There's things like Weber's law that are meant to govern sort of the relationship between the intensity of a stimulus and how intense it feels. Uh, so laws seem to be fundamental to how we do science. Although interestingly, in biology, you sometimes see fewer laws, right? And you see more what we would call mechanistic explanation. Um, right? But nonetheless, you can't really do science without encountering a law for very long. And so it's interesting to know, to think about what exactly is a law of nature, right? Are laws the things that are sort of pushing the planets around the sun? Are those the forces, and the laws are something different that make it so the forces exist, right? Um, or are laws something much thinner, some sort of just description of what we observe, right, in the world with regularity? So we're beginning with Hume, and Hume, as always, as he did with the on the subject of personal identity over time, he's sort of a skeptic, right? So he's almost always going to take the view that like whatever you thought something was, it's not really that, right? In fact, there's not really anything that corresponds to what you're talking about. So he does a sort of similar sort of deflationary approach to laws of nature. Um, And when he's talking about laws of nature, when his sort of opponent is people who think that laws of nature indicate some sort of necessary connection, right? That there's something about the force of gravity, right? The gravitational constant that forces objects, like less massive objects, to move toward more massive objects, right? When I drop, right, a pencil, the laws of nature, right, are involved in forcing that pencil to behave the way it does, right? It's necessary. It has to happen a certain way. Um, Hume's going to push back on that whole idea. He thinks it's much less sort of metaphysically thick than that, right? He's going to say, look, we observed certain regularities, right? And that's what a law is, just some regularities we observe. It just describes the way the world looks to us. So let's get into the details again. Hume is always a little bit, uh, it's just older English, and he's just a little trickier to read. So um, he starts by looking at sort of the different types of reasoning we run into when we're trying to solve various types of problems. Um, so, for example, one uh, sort of mistake we might make in reasoning is when we run into like a chain of reasoning that it's so long that we're worried we might make a mistake, like in a mathematical proof, right? Um, Other times, uh, the problems in reasoning, it's not our fault that we're making a mistake so much. It's that we're trying to use concepts that are actually kind of fuzzy and poorly defined and aren't really actually very useful in solving the problem, right? The problem is sort of just badly framed in the first place. Um, and this is a common strain throughout philosophy. It was Wittgenstein is another figure that um, takes this route frequently as well and says, look, there's no real philosophical problem here. You just have your concepts are just sort of sloppy, right? If you were more rigorous about how you define your terms, you wouldn't end up with this problem. The problem would dissolve. So Hume is uh, sort of pointing in this direction as well. So he thinks some of the just sort of badly defined concepts include the concepts of power, force, energy, and necessary connection, right? So he wants to sort of uh, investigate these terms, see if there's a better way of defining them, see if we can clarify these concepts a bit, and in the process solve or dissolve some of our philosophical problems that are related to them. So we discussed this aspect of Hume's philosophy when we talked about his account of personal identity, right? Hume is an empiricist, as opposed to, say, Descartes, who was a rationalist. Hume says, look, anything that's in your head, right, all your ideas, all your concepts had to come in through the senses, right? They had to come in through your eyes, your ears, your nose, right? Um, that's where we get our basic concepts. So the way it works, right, is the most basic concepts are stuff like red, right? Or just objects of the world, house, right? Maybe dollar, something like that. And now we combine all those simpler concepts together, right? Once we've got the basic ones in our head, we can, in a way, sort of generate new concepts, but they're always going to be built out of the building blocks of the ones that came in through the senses, right? So if you've seen a house, right, and you've seen a dollar, then maybe you can put those together for a more complex concept like household economy or something like that, right? So he doesn't deny that we have some of these sort of complex concepts, right? And probably power and force and necessary connection are among those, right? These seemingly sort of abstract concepts that don't seem immediately obviously like linked directly towards a sense impression. But he says, nonetheless, I'm an empiricist, and I take it as true that whatever concept you have in your head, you could trace it back. You could break it down into its components, and eventually those are going to trace back to something you saw or heard or smelled and so on, right? Um, and these basic concepts are going to be clear and distinct, right? Sense impressions are as clear and as obvious as you get, and all these complex concepts can be broken down into smaller ones that are clearer and more distinct. So, necessary connection, right? This is an important concept if you're thinking about laws of nature in the way that sort of we tend to think about them by default, which is that yeah, the laws of nature sort of necessitate things happening the way they are, right? Um, the Earth, right, goes around the sun every 365 or so days, right? Because of the laws of nature, the laws of gravitation, and so on, make it so it has to be that way, right? They have, it necessitates, right, things being that way. So this is the concept of necessary connection that he's thinking about. He says, okay, we have this concept of necessitation, right, of necessary connection. Um, where did that come from, right? Can we break it down into its component sensory concepts, right? What did we initially see? What got to us through our eyes or our ears that we built together into the concept of necessary connection? And he says, you can't do it with that one, right? That concept doesn't break down into sensory components, right? So, like, for example, like, where might you think that you would see this necessary connection? Well, any sort of causal interaction, right, where the forces of nature are involved, where the laws of nature are involved. So, for example, billiard balls, right? You've got a ball, right? It's hit with a certain force, it strikes another ball, and it goes off at a certain velocity. Um, so, what happens, right, when I observe billiards, right? Okay, I see one billiard ball roll, it hits another one, and then the other one rolls, right? Um, where was the necessity? Did I see the necessity, right? Did I see that the second ball had to roll when it was hit by the first ball? Um, no, we didn't see it, right? Um, you didn't see anything like a force, right? You didn't see any law of nature that forces it. All you saw, right, is one ball hit, another ball go. If you could see something like the force, right, like if you saw like an arrow or something that was pointing where the ball would go, you'd be able to predict you'd be a perfect pool player, right? You'd be able to predict everywhere the ball would go all the time, right? If you could actually see the forces, right, see these necessary connections. He says, no, you can't, right? Um, you you always make mistakes playing pool because all you really have is just experience, right? You never see the forces, you never see a necessary connection. But he wants to consider, right, some possible objections, right? So some people might say, look, no, you don't experience necessary connection when you observe the world, but you do actually experience necessary connection when you observe the relationship between your mind and your body, right? So I can think to myself, I'm going to move my arm and then I move my arm, right? Did I just observe, right, the necessary connection between my intention and the action, right? Sort of a power. I observed some sort of willpower that makes things happen. Um, and Hume says, no, you didn't observe that. Here's, if you actually are careful, right, and think about what you saw or what you experienced, is you experienced a willing, you experienced some sort of thought or something that says, I'm going to move my arm, and then you experience the arm moving, right? But what you didn't experience was the necessary connection between the two, right? Um, right, just like the billiard balls, it's only sort of out of custom. You've observed this happening all the time. Whenever you think I'm going to raise my arm, typically it raises, right? Soon after, you sort of expect the two to come together, just like when you observe one ball hitting another ball, you expect the other one to roll. Um, but it's just sort of a inductive, right? You just observed it enough times that you come to expect it. But at no point do you see like the actual force, right? And again, because if you were seeing it for the first time, you would never be able to predict it, right? So, like for example, right? Um, try to use your will. Try to decide to move your liver. See if it works. Do the same as if you were raising your hand, right? So I'm going to move my liver now. Did it move? No, right? Okay, did I observe something different happening that time, right? Not really, right? It's sort of the same experience as moving my arm. It's just when I will my arm to move, it moves, and I will my liver to move, it doesn't. But I can't really tell what the difference was, right? The experience was kind of the same. Um, so he says, look, whatever difference there is between, right, willing to move my arm and willing to move my liver, something obviously was different because in one case it worked, the other it didn't. But that, whatever that difference that is not accessible by me through introspection, right? So I didn't get the idea of necessary connection even from sort of inner sensation, right, by peering inside my mind. So I don't derive it from external world. I don't derive it from the internal world. Similarly, like suppose that you were suddenly paralyzed, right? And all of a sudden you could no longer will your arm to move and have it move. Um, would you notice that some power or some necessary connection disappeared? Probably not, right? If you woke up in the hospital bed after an accident or something, right? And you thought, okay, I'm gonna go grab that cup of water, and all of a sudden your arm just didn't move, you would be surprised, right? You wouldn't immediately notice, oh no, I've lost this power, I've lost this necessary connection, and then be able to predict that your arm wouldn't move, right? That's not how it goes at all, right? So all that to say, you never observed any power, any necessary connection, anything like that, um, between your willing something, your body to move, and your body moving, right? Um, and anyway, we know from anatomy that what happens is whatever goes on in your brain when you're willing, it sends signals through the nerves, which in turn, right, propagate signals through other nerves that eventually get to your muscle and then your arm, right? And I don't experience any of that as like a conscious sensation, right? I don't like see or introspect one nerve, right, the synapse sort of communicating to the next nerve and so on. So um, the actual story, right, of how moving your arm works is definitely not uh, sub an object of your introspection, right? So you are not getting any concept of necessary connection, inner sensation or your outer sensation. Okay, another objection. Maybe we get the idea of like powers or necessary connection not by the will's power to move the body per se, but by the will's power to call forth ideas, right? So even if I'm paralyzed, right? Anytime I want to think something, I can think it, can't I? That's a sort of power that I have, right? Um, but Hume says even that I'm not so sure. I mean, yeah, certainly, right? I can sort of decide to think about something and then think about it. But the question is, am I observing the necessary connection there, right? Um, he says if it was true that we had this power to just call an idea out of nothing, right? He says we would notice it, right? It seems like a pretty impressive power, right? And he says we don't though. What we notice is I'm going to think of a pink elephant, and then I have an image of a pink elephant, right? I don't see the connection between that willing and the idea coming forth, right? Um, kind of what we observe is just that succession, right? The idea sort of coming out of nowhere. Um, and then another point is it's sort of parallel to the liver case. We It's not like we have complete power over what ideas we have. Like a lot of the times stuff just pops out of your head out of nowhere. even things that you really would rather not think about, right? You'll sort of have these negative thoughts or whatever that like come out of nowhere, and you're like, "Oh, I wish I could stop thinking about that." Right? You have actually fairly limited control over your ideas, and in those cases, you don't notice a difference. You don't notice that the power or the necessary connection was missing, right? So now I'm going to think of a pink elephant, and then maybe later some embarrassing moment from my past sort of pops into my head, and I don't notice like, oh, in the first case there was a necessary connection and I noticed it, in the other case it was absent. Not really, right? You again, the first time you just notice a succession between, okay, I'm going to will this and then it happens, and the other time you notice, oh, the thing just happens, but there's no observation of like whatever connects those. So um, it can't be the case then that we observe any powers in the cases where we do sort of will something and it happens, right? We'd notice the difference, he thinks. All right, another possibility, he's considering lots of objections. This is a good model for your papers, right? If you, sometimes I find students feel feel like they've presented their argument and like they have like 3 pages left, right? Um, usually you haven't. Usually you could have said much more, right, to support your argument. But even so, maybe you did. Maybe it's fairly straightforward, and you have like space left, right? Um, consider objections like Hume is doing here, right? A lot of these philosophy papers that we're reading, most of the paper is considering objections, right? So you can do that all day long if you're running out of space. That's way better than just sort of rambling and saying the same thing over and over, which some people feel compelled to do when they've trying to pad, right? So if you need to pad, objections, objections. Okay, so another objection he considers. Maybe it's God who intervenes, right, and causes every billiard ball to move, right? When a billiard ball hits it, right, God is the necessary connection that causes the next thing. And when I will an idea or when I will my arm to raise, it's God that, right? He is the force. He is the necessary connection. He makes it happen, right? Um, but then if you're an empiricist, right? And now Descartes would probably part ways with Hume here, right? But Hume says, okay, if it's God that does it, where do we get our idea of God? Have you seen God, right? Now, some people claim to have, but most of us haven't, right? So it's not even clear where the idea of God comes from for Hume, right? So in conclusion, he thinks, yeah, we never observe anything like necessary connection or force, whatever this thing that would underlie a sort of robust notion of laws of nature as like making things happen, right? He says we never observe anything like that. And since I'm an empiricist, um, if we don't observe it, then this word necessary connection, this concept we think we have, is empty, right? It's meaningless, right? Um, because again, he thinks if you have a concept, it only actually has content, right, or means something if you can trace it back to some impression. But he says, I don't know what impression this could possibly correspond to, right? We don't ever observe anything like that. So he doesn't just leave us in total uh, at a total loss for ideas, right? Like he does with the self, right? He sort of demolishes the traditional idea of the self and says, look, well, here's something you could mean by the self, a bundle of impressions, right? And similarly, he says, look, I don't think by laws of nature, necessary connections, you can mean anything like what we typically thought we meant, right? As like, again, something that sort of influences the world. Um, but here's what we do observe. And this must be, if we mean anything by necessary connection, this must be what we mean. Just constant conjunctions of events, regularities, right? So over and over, we see a billiard ball hit another billiard ball at a certain angle, and we see the second one fly off at the same angle every time, right? If you keep the angle, you could do it all day long, right? And if you're good enough at hitting it with the right force at the right point, it'll fly off in the same direction every single time, right? Um, I can over and over, every time I think I'd like to raise my arm, right? I can do it. I can do it. So we definitely see regularities, consistency. Um, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's all you need. Maybe that's all we mean by necessary connection. Maybe that's all we mean by laws of nature is observed regularities, right? So we've seen whatever the effect is, right, according to the law, follow the cause so many times that we assume that it just has to happen, right? That the effect must happen because of the cause. But we actually have no sort of rational reason to believe that. It, it's always possible right? That I could hit a billiard ball and it just doesn't move at all, right? Or it flies off in a totally new direction, right? Um, there's nothing that says it has to happen the way it's always happened, um, but that regularity is something, right? It is it is what we mean when we talk about laws of nature for Hume. Now, importantly, we're supposed to be talking about laws of nature, and you may notice Hume never mentions the word law here, right? But necessary connection is the same concept, roughly, right? So again, the laws are supposed to necessitate the things in the world, right? Um, so why can't I jump to the moon? Because the laws of physics prevent it, right? Why must I grow old and die? Because the laws, such as they are in biology, require it, right? Um, so hopefully, I mean, Hume is sort of seductive and convincing, right? So maybe you hadn't thought too much about laws of nature ever in the first place, right? And Hume's the first person you've heard talk about it in any length, and you find him very convincing. You're like, yeah, that must be what laws are, just regularities. Like, why did you ever think that that laws were like somehow pushing the planets around or whatever, right? So this is Hume's point, and we'll see another, a more contemporary philosopher in the next lecture that sort of drives that point home before we then look at some problems with this sort of what we call regularity account, right? This very thin account of laws of nature that is just like laws of nature are just regularities we have observed in the past. We're going to see some serious problems with that, and in our final lecture, we'll see a move back towards the necessitarian account.